Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm back. I took last week off from the podcast after it all got too much for me, frankly. I was pretty burned out from work, anxiety over some doggy health issues. Bendico's fine. He's just missing 3 teeth. And carryover exhaustion and or unprocessed feelings from some podcast-related trauma in mid-April, which I'll talk about in this week's conversation, but regular listeners know what I mean. But the week off helped, I'll be honest. Although I almost wound up missing this week's show too, and I'll fill you in on that in a minute. But not having a show to record, not having to read, prep, record with somebody, edit, intro, post, all that stuff. It let me sort of collect myself and just kind of recharge a little bit. And normally when I miss a week, it's for like a holiday thing or end of last year when I got hit with COVID. But this was just can't do it. Gotta just beg off and give myself a little time. The upshot was, by Sunday, I was driving myself crazy, and I realized that meant I could finally finish the long, unawaited second issue of my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. I figured all I'd have to do is take the anxiety that I normally put into all of that stuff that I just mentioned about a new show and channel it into writing, editing, culling my prose, poems, and art, and some photos, putting it all into a 32-page layout, editing 12,000 words of a 2015 Clive James interview down to 3,000 words and regretting every single one that I had to cut. But yeah, that's how I spent my Sunday. That was 2 weeks ago, not this past one for Memorial Day weekend. But the upshot was I already had most of the pieces done already. I had lots and lots of stuff. I was just sort of hemming and hawing for years over some unfinished pieces. And I decided that morning, Gil, those can wait till issue number 3. Just get this thing done, get it out the door. And by day's end that Sunday, I had the whole shebang ready. And on Monday, I looked it back over, gave it an edit, sent it off to the printer on Tuesday. Ought to have it back. It's it's a remote printer, not the local one I used for the first one in 2020. But I ought to have that back in early June, along with a second printing of the first issue, because I ran out of copies of that and realized there's a lot of people I can bore with this stuff. So mid-June, you can expect a mailer probably with 1 or 2 issues of my zine, and there you go. I know it's a little weird to use R&R and downtime to commit a new artistic project and generate new sources of anxiety, but that's me all over. So about this week, I almost missed this one too, because middle of the week before Memorial Day, I got hit with a bout of cellulitis in my right ear, on my right ear, not inside the ear, not like an ear infection, but literally the surface, all the cartilage, inflamed, feverish, burning, incredibly painful to touch, probably from like a bug bite that I must have scratched, got infected, blah, blah, blah. Could not lie down on my right side to sleep, which is my preferred side. Just terrible pain. Thursday, I had to go into the city for about 6-hour workshop with a drug company about redacted topic, and bowled my way through that. But Friday morning, got to a doctor before Memorial Day weekend, got set up on some antibiotics, and luckily they started whomping it by Sunday evening. And so Monday, I could actually put on a pair of headphones and record this week's show. So my guest this time is Scott Samuelson, who's the author of the wonderful new book, Rome as a Guide to the Good Life, a Philosophical Grand Tour. It's from University of Chicago Press, and, well, past guest Scott Newstock, How to Think Like Shakespeare, sometime in 2021 we recorded. Anyway, he strongly recommended / nudged / browbeat me into checking this one out for the show. And he was not wrong. This book is a phenomenal thing. It's this exploration of the Eternal City of Rome, using art, history, architecture, philosophy, biography, and more to lead the readers into the soul of their souls, as it were. Let's see, as the subtitle says, it's a grand tour with caps for the G&T in that 19th century tradition. And Scott uses these different locations in Rome to trigger essays on the good life, as espoused by philosophers, poets, artists, filmmakers, and other figures throughout history. And his love for Rome and those thinkers, it's on display on every page. I mean, he really offers this friendly voice that kind of brings you insight into the world before you, and it evokes this city, both present and stretching back thousands of years, and the lives within it, the politics, the waves of people who've come and gone over time through Rome, and the thought that it's inculcated. And religion plays into it too, of course. And he, as we talk about, goes into the good and the bad of imperial Rome, the wonders that it built, and all the horrors that it required to build that. But yeah, it's really this amazing book. I learned an awful lot from this. Even in the sections on philosophers, I had some knowledge of from my old St. John's days, because Scott does this great job of not just explaining philosophy and the philosophers, but synthesizing what they meant into the world of people. As ever, I'm going to fail to do this one justice, but I think the enthusiasm I show for the book in the conversation will tell you enough about why I love it. It is an utter joy to read. Brings not just the city to life, but also feeds the soul. Which I needed, and I think a lot of us could use. So, all of that said, on top of this, the production and art design of this book are just fantastic. And we talk about that during the conversation, so I don't want to go into it too much here, except to say it's a gorgeous book that's visually a joy to read. I savored literally just looking upon each page, because of how well it's put together. And it's not in terms of, images embedded into text. It's just a drawing at the start of each chapter and maybe one or two photo illustrations inside. But it's just so beautifully designed and laid out. It's a wonder. Oh, and also each chapter has a bit of a tour guide section at the end. So in theory, this could also serve as a guidebook, albeit, without maps. So go get Rome as a Guide to the Good Life, a philosophical grand tour, out now from University of Chicago Press. And you can either blame Scott or me when you start trying to price a vacation to Rome the moment you finish it. Now here's Scott's bio. Scott Samuelson lives in Iowa City, Iowa, where he is professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College. He has taught the humanities in universities, colleges, prisons, houses of worship, and bars. He has also worked as a movie reviewer, television host, and sous chef at a French restaurant on a gravel road. He is the author of The Deepest Human Life and 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering, both also published by the University of Chicago Press. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Scott Samuelson. But tell me about your history with Rome and where the book comes from, which are 2 separate things. And I know it's sort of in the introduction, but, fill us in.
Yeah. Well, I had been, so to speak, mentally traveling to Rome for a long time before I ever actually showed up there. In particular, I studied Latin in college, and I got really interested in ancient Roman philosophy in graduate school. But I didn't actually go to Rome until I was, in my late 30s, getting close to 40. And I was invited to be a co-instructor of a summer study abroad course there. And, by the end of my first day, my first kind of jet lag day, I had already really fallen in love with the city. I mean, it's the way I try to put it in the book is I think I say something like, being in Rome made me feel as big in my humanity as possible while still being human. It just really made me come alive. And then, but I was at the same time trying to be a teacher, even though I was learning more in a couple weeks than I'd had in decades before, quite honestly. And I wanted to teach philosophy. And I realized that one way of teaching philosophy in Rome would just be to point at say that's a statue of Marcus Aurelius. Now let me tell you about Marcus Aurelius. But, and there's something to be said for that. But I wanted to try to think about what it would mean to engage with the city philosophically, to be immersed in the sites, and then to kind of think about the questions that they raise. And I got really interested in sort of blending history and philosophy together, I guess I can say. I mean, I could keep going on, but that's I think how the book started for me.
And the act of writing it, how long did it take you really to synthesize philosophy and place the way you do? I mean, you do it beautifully in the book, and we'll talk about a lot of aspects of it. But what was that learning process like for you? How long did it really? When did you feel comfortable enough to tackle this?
Well, so I'd been going to Rome. It had been maybe 8 or 9 summers, and then I got super interested in the tombstone of Rosa Bathurst in the Protestant cemetery. And so I just started digging up history about it as best as I could. But I realized that I wasn't just writing about the history of this thing. I was also interested in the kind of philosophical questions that the epitaph posed for me. And so I just wrote up something about it, not really knowing where it would go. And I was like, wow, I really enjoyed doing this. I really enjoyed sort of blending place and history and philosophy together. And it dawned on me, I was like, wow, people go to Rome as a kind of guide to the good life. I can just keep going with this. And all of a sudden, a lot of things started to appear in my mind as possibilities of chapters. And so I started writing it. And then at that point, the pandemic hit. And so I was in a kind of curious situation of I was writing about the importance of place while I was in travel, while I was locked at home. But it became a tremendous, it sort of was a life-saving thing for me, kept me from going crazy during the pandemic to just really dive into the research and writing of the book. So it took me really, I guess, a couple of years to write it, and then probably another year to really polish it and work on it. And it happened pretty much over the course of the pandemic's tenure.
And you've close out the book with, well, not close out, but near the conclusion, it's all about Giordano Bruno. And I got me wondering how much of a memory palace of Rome you had actually built, prior to this, when you actually had to sit down in lockdown and have nowhere to go and revisit the city that you kind of love.
Yeah, I mean, as maybe some of your listeners know, there is this.
Oh, my listeners are smart. Trust me, they'll get it.
But the mythic origin of it is that a poet was reciting a poem and then was called away. Presumably by the gods, and at that moment the house collapses in and destroys and kills everyone inside at the banquet. But the poet is then able to identify the mangled bodies by recalling where they were. So the art of memory has always been linked, or it was aboriginally linked to loss and destruction. And certainly, I mean, Rome itself is a kind of great city of sort of going through destruction over and over again, and yet remembering itself. out of that destruction. But for me, it had a kind of personal thing of I was severed from the ability to go to the city. I had 2 canceled plane tickets in my inbox folder. And yet, it kind of heightened all of my memories of the city itself. And so I certainly was, I think, drawing on my memory palace. Luckily, we have some other tools to help us as well nowadays.
Yeah, there's
or unluckily, I don't know. Maybe it'd be better for me to have just drawn on my memories, but it was not so bad for me to use the internet in my library.
We'll be going to Athens instead of Rome if we do that, and getting into the Phaedrus, and whether writing something down is better than doing it in speech. But again, that's just drawing on my St. John's background, which gets scanter every decade that goes by. But that notion of structuring it as a grand tour, kind of falling into that I don't want to say ancient, that 19th century tradition, and the sense of sort of balancing the essay with the tour guide aspect. How I don't want to say how much of a challenge was it, but what was it like sort of finding that voice and the multiple voices for the sections within each chapter?
Yeah, it was, like I said, once I kind of found my groove with that, it was relatively easy, though I will say there were times it was more difficult than others. But it in a way helped me to find my voice. And I think this always is helping me whenever I'm writing to find my voice, to think about actual companions, in this case, thinking about friends or students or people, even my kids, that I wanted to be taking to Rome, and, thinking about what I would want to say to them, both wanting to point out all of the amazing things and to tell them the juicy stories, but then also wanting to really dive into what it means to think about it. And so when I focused on actually trying to communicate to real people, it helped me to find the right kind of companionable voice, or at least as best as I could do.
Yeah, I was going to go like early on with a Virgil and Dante guide thing, but it really, your voice is so much friendlier, frankly, than that Dante puts in Virgil's mouth. But yeah, really, I've never been to Rome, and it kills me. Reading the book is just I've kept it from my wife at this point, because I know the moment I show her, she's going to flip out and, well, that's where we're going next, which I now understand I have to do. Thanks to you.
Well, I'm hoping that my book does do that for some people. I'm hoping that it's a good kind of just armchair travel book, but I'm hoping that it inspires a lot of people to get out of their armchairs and head to Rome.
Certainly. Yeah, I did want to ask you, what's your second most resonant / important place in Rome, assuming that the first is the Mithraeum under the Basilica of San Clemente, where you met your wife all those years ago. But, and you could talk about that too. But what's second most meaningful to you?
Yeah, good question. Second most. I don't know. There's a lot of second most there. I really do love the Protestant cemetery, also known as the non-Catholic cemetery. Just because I've always liked graveyards, and I've always found them, sort of naturally philosophical places where you start to reflect on life and what kind of memories you want to leave behind. But the Protestant cemetery is just one of the loveliest graveyards you can go to. But also, just to read the epitaphs is just really, really moving experience, because these are people, almost all of whom, so to speak, died on their journey. They went on an adventure and ended up in Rome somehow. And the kind of stories that just sort of appear here and there, I find incredibly moving. For that matter, another really moving spot that is one that sometimes gets overlooked is in a very famous place, the Capitoline Museums. But the Capitoline Museums kind of sit on top of the Capitoline Hill, and they're on each side of the top of the hill, but there's a tunnel that goes underneath the hill that you can go from one part of the museum to the other. And in that underground tunnel, there are all these fragments of ancient Roman tombs, many of whom are, just sort of normal people. These aren't just the tombs of emperors or illustrious figures. These are the everyday tombs of people. And again, I find the epitaphs there too incredibly moving in a human sense.
Yeah, to me, they were weirdly the most resonant parts of you start the book with the Protestant cemetery and the amazing epitaphs there, but there are a number of inscriptions that crop up over the course of the book that, wedded to the philosophers themselves or the historical figures that you bring in, the importance of them and the sense of lives that are remembered in certain ways and what we want to be remembered as really just struck me. Maybe it's because I'm death obsessed at this point, but it really worked for me as this sort of recurring theme throughout the book. But again, that's Rome as eternal city.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Sure, this is a conversation.
I know that you just had this experience of finding someone who was dead, and my first part of the book is called Remember Death. I'm curious if in reading through it you found it resonant in any ways, or if you found it kind of a little offensive.
Oh, no. I was utterly moved by the first chapter. And one of the great things about your book is that I refuse to binge. Every time I finish a chapter, it's like, gonna wait. Not going to just dive into the next one, going to really take in what was here. And you start off so well with the Rosa Bathurst epitaph and the story and everything around her and what ultimately her life meant and continues to mean. My experience, and I talk about it in the monologue that I recorded the day after discovering that guest who was dead. Essentially, I could have left without witnessing him and, just left it to the police and the EMTs and everything. They were the ones who were inside, but I made a sort of pretext to go in just to ask the police if they needed anything else, but also knowing that someone, and I talk about it, and I'm not going to cry this time when I talk about it. I hope, that someone who wasn't on the clock should pay witness to this or bear witness to this guy. He was an important person. Somebody should see him before he's gone, who at least had some inkling of who he was and why he mattered in the world. And it's not to denigrate the police or the EMTs, but they were there for their job. And for me, it was this sense of, I'm at least going to look over in that bedroom and see this guy. And yeah, okay, there's a salacious thing that ties into it and blah, blah, blah. But it's not like I had my phone out or something. But there was a sense that, I owed it to him, to this guy I'd never met before, but, that it was owed by the world, I guess, that someone who cares should bear witness. And so, again, reading about the Protestant cemetery and the stories of the lives that were there really, really worked for me. It resonated with what I went through recently. It resonated with my the longer story is getting diagnosed with leukemia 2 years ago and not getting bad news, but having 10 days of thinking it was going to be the worst news and kind of really confronting mortality for the first time at 50 years old. That this book in particular was very important to me, and I plan on rereading it and also sending out copies to a few friends of mine and family because of the wedding you bring of life and death, I guess, throughout it, which is a giant overarching terms. And, you again discuss it through various philosophers and historians and the art of the city. But sorry, I'm doing all the talking.
No. I'm very interested in what you're saying. I mean, it's bringing back some kind of memories for me as well, as I was just thinking about writing the book under lockdown. One of my dear friends, John Rapson, a great jazz musician and composer who's head of the jazz department at the University of Iowa, had been given a year to live after being diagnosed with a kind of recurring cancer, and did indeed die sort of towards the end of COVID, not of COVID, but of this cancer. And one of the kind of curious things was that, I would run into people again and again during that time and most people were all freaked out by COVID and doom scrolling and whatnot. But whenever I saw my friend John, he was actually the happiest person that I saw. He'd come to terms. I mean, he'd had his dark nights of the soul. It wasn't as if it was easy for him, but he'd kind of come to terms with his mortality and was just, fully wide awake, curious about the world, wanting to treasure the times that he had with people. And I do think that too probably was lurking in the background, even though I don't mention him in the book, of thinking about that. I mean, the Roman philosophers, as really philosophers throughout time, have emphasized the importance of reflecting on our mortality and reflecting on death. But, part of what I wanted to do in the book was that while it's certainly worthwhile to do that in an abstract way, sometimes it's a much more meaningful thing to be doing it in a place that really evokes it, like a cemetery. Obviously, the most kind of face-to-face powerful version of it is to be with someone when they die, or in my case, to be with someone who is dying. But I do think that the kind of philosophical reflection combined with the intimacy, with the actual life and death experience, that's perhaps the most potent way of reminding us to live a good life.
How difficult is it to convey that to students, just given their youth, and knowing that these trips are summer student trips when you're going to Rome and you're sort of making those explorations? Are there degrees of, you don't get this because you're 20, but,
that's a mixed bag. I mean, first of all, I have been fortunate enough in my career and even my study abroad career to take any number of so-called non-traditional students to Rome, people in their late 20s and their 30s and their 40s and even in their 50s, in fact, even in their 60s. And so sometimes my students, or at least companions on the trip, are in a position to understand this stuff full on. But when it comes to the 19-year-old on the trip, it is true that it's pretty hard to get their mortality to sink in. And yet at the same time, they often are really fascinated by these issues of death and certainly are attracted to just the aesthetics of death in Rome. The skulls holding hourglasses and the Capuchin crypt, where you have, the crypt of Santa Maria della Concezione, which is just, has like 3,000 bones or 3,000 skeletons of friars in it. I mean, they're fascinated by that, in part, I think, because, we sort of turn away from death in our culture. We're deniers of death in certain regards. And so, they have a fascination with it. And even though they are far from really, I think, understanding their mortality, as I was when I was their age too, I think at the same time, they understand that it is somehow important to be in touch with it in one way, shape, or form.
And you do mention, I guess it's in the introduction, that notion of how the city and the study of everything that's there works towards the notion of dying well and living better. It's I starting to travel again after, pandemia and the various changes in my life, turning 50, getting the non-death sentence and all this other craziness. I find things are differently resonant, that there are new tones that I'm hearing, I suppose, at least.
Yeah. And I think it's the way I kind of think of it is it's a long apprenticeship. I mean,
if you're lucky,
I feel like I've been, I've been reading these ancient Roman philosophers telling me to reflect on death for a very long time. And I think I have, and I think I profited from it even in my 20s to be seriously thinking about it. And yet I have to say, after having recently turned 50 myself, having known friends who have died, having been with people when they died, I feel as if, I get closer and closer to this. And yet I still realize I've got a ways to go as well. When I think about my friend John and his proximity to his own death, I realize, that I'm still an apprentice myself and learning how to die well and live better.
We only get one shot, so But tell me about the nature of the book itself, the drawings that get included, the production behind it. Because I love University of Chicago, but I was not expecting a book this gorgeous when it showed up. I don't know how much of that was, just a thrill for you versus the kind of nudging them to, hey, we could do this too.
Well, I am really happy with the team at the University of Chicago Press with this book. In fact, I've had a couple people at the University of Chicago Press say this is the most beautiful book that they've gotten to work on. My editor, Elizabeth Branch Dyson, great woman and great editor, we talked back and forth, and I had originally, just as I was writing it, I was just including pictures all the time. I probably had 100 pictures in the text, that I just thrown in, not thinking that all of them would make it into the book, but I was often talking about stuff and I'd want to show it. And so we talked about what we wanted to do with imagery, and we understood that it was important. And talking back and forth, what we came to was that there would be something nice about hand-drawn imagery. I mean, first of all, so many images from Rome are fairly well known, so you don't really need to see another photograph of the Colosseum and whatnot. But we felt like, hand-drawn images would sort of, speak to this idea of being a thoughtful traveler, really trying to take this stuff in by looking at it. And so they commissioned drawings by Lauren Nassef, who had lived in Rome briefly. And so she was happy to do them. And I think they turned out really well. And I actually think that also the team at Chicago sort of designed its own font for the book that is based on, ancient Roman writing, but kind of updating it, making it a little more contemporarily stylish.
Yeah. And the italics are just amazing. The italics are unique and really jumped out at me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, to me, I'm really happy that it turned out this way. I think everyone likes a nice feeling looking book. But to me, particularly with this book, which is so much about, the physicality of being in Rome and the objects themselves, I'm very happy that this object itself, has its own kind of attractive aesthetics.
Have you been able to go back to Rome since, or is it set for this summer?
I am going in 1 week.
Wow. I'm glad we'll post this one before the trip, but you can come back and tell us how it was. What are you looking forward to seeing? Or is there a thing you're most dying for, as it were?
Well, there are lots of places that that have a lot of sentimental value for me that I'm looking to kind of revisit. One thing that for some reason I've been really focused on. I have the audacity in the book to call it the most beautiful thing in Rome, is the Ludovisi throne, which happens to be in the Palazzo Altemps, which is this just incredible relief of showing Aphrodite being born from the sea. She's being pulled out of the sea by two figures, and she's wearing a kind of see-through gown. It's a really marvelous thing, and I love this Palazzo Altemps. It's a kind of 15th century palace that had an art collection at least since the 16th century. And it's just full of great stuff, and it's right off the Piazza Navona, which is a kind of big tourist destination, and yet it's almost always mostly an empty museum. And so it's one of my favorite things to just sit in front of that Ludovisi throne and ponder it and getting it to myself. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that again. But there's any number of other things.
I'm sure. I didn't want to put you on the spot too much because it would sound just like a tourist thing or something like that. But yeah, I couldn't imagine the gap especially when you're living it mentally for a couple of years to really think about what it's going to mean again in the flesh. But
yeah, I honestly, I'm a little scared. I mean, because I have been investing it with such a mental charge, it's always a little nerve wracking to go back, but Rome has a way of not disappointing.
You're killing me. I know I have to. And the problem is most of my European travel is tied to business trips. And there's this annual pharmaceutical conference I go to, rotates from city to city. And this year is Barcelona, which nice. And my wife will come along for that one. But Italy, the only thing we get is Milan every 7 or 8 years, which is okay, but not as bad as the regular stop every 3 years, which is Frankfurt, and less said about that, the better. But
well, I will say, when you go to Milan, or for that matter, Rome again, book some tickets in advance. It didn't used to be the case so much, but nowadays it's getting almost impossible to get into places, at least in high season, unless you have some tickets booked in advance.
We'll pull that off for sure. But tell me about your philosophical background. Discovering Aquinas at 16, I think I saw in your bio. But tell me where philosophy began for you and where you settled on the Romans.
Well, it's my kind of origin story with regard to philosophy is when I was 16 years old. I was in the Iowa City Public Library, and I wish I could remember the actual book. It was some anthology, probably a philosophical anthology. And I picked it up and was just kind of randomly flipping through it. I was waiting for someone, and I saw that one of the sections of one of the chapters was called 5 Proofs of God by some guy named Thomas Aquinas. And it was just a little excerpt of his famous 5 Ways to God. And I thought, I didn't even think you could prove God, let alone have 5 proofs of God. And so I read the proofs, and I was mostly uncomprehending of them, quite honestly. It went over my head. And yet, at the same time, I felt like whatever this guy is doing is what I want to be doing. I mean, I just had this feeling that this was a really, profound use of what it means to be a human intellect. And so I was like, I'm going to start reading this philosophy stuff, not really knowing much about it. And I quickly found my way to the existentialists, as I think a lot of people do when they're first getting into philosophy. And I really loved them. And I loved how they blended philosophy and literature, because I was also really interested in literature. And so I went to college and I majored in philosophy. I thought about majoring in literature as well, but I never really liked how literature was discussed in academia.
You and I are about the same age, so I get where you're coming from, because that was high deconstruct. Now, I went to a concentrated version of that at Hampshire College, where it's just high deconstruction era. So, yeah.
Well, and it just felt like kind of low level philosophy. I felt like I'd rather just be doing the philosophy. Sure, yeah. And in any case, and then I went to Emory University for graduate school, and there I really got interested in Roman philosophy as well. And curiously, I think that part of it was not altogether unlike my original interest in existentialism. Roman philosophy felt like it really spoke to life and death questions in a way that mattered. It didn't feel too abstract. And also the Roman philosophers and Roman philosophy kind of generally often blended literature and philosophy in a kind of similar way. So I really liked that. But I was really interested in the whole history of philosophy. I have always resisted, for better and for worse, becoming a specialist. I'm grateful that there are specialists, but it just never was, I think, going to be my forte. And so I always wanted to be doing things that spoke to bigger questions and drew on the entire history of philosophy. So it's not as if I've only focused on Roman philosophy by any means, but it certainly was something that meant a lot to me, and it's something that maybe doesn't always fit as well in the normal histories of philosophy and teaching of philosophy. And so I wanted to kind of figure out a way of emphasizing that. And so, again, this study abroad trip in the book gave me a chance to do that.
As I mentioned in our introductory email before this, I did St. John's College for my master's, and a very Athens-centric place. And I didn't understand what that really meant until decades later when I was back at St. John's sitting down with one of my favorite tutors, who said, we really give short shrift to the Romans. And here's some of what you should have been reading 20 years ago. Maybe, sit down with some of this stuff. And it really opened me up in certain ways. And it was purely an unfounded bias on my part. I always treated the Aeneid as though it was the knockoff of Homer, the way, as I put it in my dumb comparable day, the way Kobe Bryant was trying to knock off Michael Jordan as a copy, but not actually, exceeding. Right. And then finally sitting down with him and realizing, oh, no, okay, Gil, you were completely wrong. you're getting so much more out of this. If you'd read this in your 20s, you might have been a better person, or at least learn more, I guess, instead of being constrained artificially. But yeah, we can fall into certain silos, I guess. And I mean, and clearly it's a great thing to have some Athens centrism in one's education. I mean, it's more than most people get. The Romans themselves were very Athens centric in their education. So I think that all that's well and good, but I do think that it's a bit of almost a historical anomaly that people can be more Athens-centric than Rome-centric. I mean, in many periods, many of the great periods of Western history, Rome has been what was looked to as the real source of an education, and Greece kind of secondarily. I wonder if it's how much of that is tied in this weird conception of things to the double wedding of religion and Catholicism tied to Rome, kind of, I don't want to even say overshadowing it as a philosophical center, but yeah, we'll go with that, overshadowing it as a philosophical center. And again, you do a great job throughout the book of showing the way the threads interweave, but between philosophy and Christianity, and you have that great Stoicism, the blending of Stoicism and Christianity passage that, maybe gives us some reconciliation for, how to look at the world and approach it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, just practically speaking, people were trained in Latin much more than they were ever trained in Greek. And so it was, easier to get your philosophy through Cicero, than it was through Plato. And certainly the kind of religious, destiny was also an important part of it. But I also think that Rome the Roman writers, Cicero being a really good example, are philosophers, but they are also people with a deep, deep concern for politics and history and bringing those things together. And to me, that's one of the unique and powerful things about the Roman philosophers is that certainly in one sense, the ancient Greeks are a much more, original set of theorists. Rome doesn't, Rome's Stoicism and Epicureanism, and even Cicero's kind of eclecticism, look back to, the Greek models. But at the same time, I think of my kind of musical analogy is I think of Roman philosophy a bit like jazz, that maybe jazz musicians are all going to play body and soul, and in that sense are not creative. But what they do with body and soul is incredibly creative, and that's to me where the Romans kind of have something unique is taking these powerful philosophical ideas from Greece, but then really trying to put them into play with politics and human life, and kind of improvising in that sense. And so, and I think there's something really valuable about that kind of philosophical improvisation, and maybe worthwhile for us now when,
a certain kind of academic philosophy can be so heavily theoretical, when maybe it'd be more interesting to put some of that theory back into play with human life and improvise a bit with it.
Yeah, I'd wondered about that. And it comes up in your conversation with Athens, with the Plato and Aristotle figures pointing up, pointing down, the sense of political philosophy versus the transcendent, I guess.
Yeah, right.
And that which to me, looks like that comparison of city and soul. Whether the city is the soul writ large, and again, getting back to Plato, et cetera, what Rome says through a history that you document very well in terms of the excesses, abuses, and horrors, along with the beauty and the achievements of it all. But yeah, the sense of, I guess, the immanent and transcendent, or the
Right.
the way these guys.
Right. And what's great about you're of course referring to Raphael's School of Athens, with Plato and Aristotle at the center of it. And I just adore that image. And it's really an image worth diving into for people, because not only is the stuff with Plato and Aristotle so iconic and fascinating, but really everything in the painting is really quite fascinating. But one of the things that's great about it, what Raphael is doing, in a sense, and that I think that Rome itself, the city of Rome itself, does, is that it kind of scrambles that question. I mean, so on the one hand, should you be pointing up, or should you be applying it back down to human life? Should you be dealing with the transcendent or with the political? Raphael just sort of shows the conversation itself as being crucial, shows the back and forth as being crucial. And Rome itself can totally scramble one's sense of what actually is transcendent and religious, and what is earthly and political. And it can so scramble them that you don't know which is which sometimes, or can get confused about them. And while maybe that's not always theoretically satisfying, it to me seems true to life that that these two things are always sort of in conversation, sometimes arguing, sometimes getting along, sometimes confusing us altogether.
Oh, that's part of the wonder of your book, that sense of the irreconcilability, but the humanity of it all, that it isn't simply some lofty, plane upon plane upon plane. In a sense, it's the opposite, where you start going lower and lower as you document with the basilica, where you keep finding layers underneath and more things that have stranger resonances to us deep inside.
Well, thank you. That's nicely said. I'm glad that comes across.
You can use that as a blurb if you can figure out a way to transcribe it.
I might.
But yeah, now tell me though, you mentioned how your students that you bring over there aren't always, the 19-year-olds. And I know you've talked about teaching Plato to plumbers, the notion of teaching outside strict academic settings. Tell me how that works. Tell me how it goes. What's the and how it's changed, perhaps, teaching the non-traditional students in philosophy.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact is that I'm very, very grateful to my non-traditional students. In a way, I feel as if they have taught me very profoundly. I hope that I've taught them important things, but I know that they have brought so much to me. My first book is called The Deepest Human Life: An Introduction to Philosophy for Everyone. And there I really try to blend the history of philosophy with the stories of primarily non-traditional students, and in part to try to show what I'm trying to describe here about what they've taught me. But they, when you study philosophy, or at least when I studied philosophy, it was very easy to get into theoretical questions, and you start to think about if a theory works or not, and you're thinking of counterexamples, and it becomes kind of intellectually incredibly interesting, so much so that you can sort of lose touch with what these things are really about. And my non-traditional students often came in with a kind of frank about saying, look, we understand this philosophy business tells us something about life and death and how to live. So what has it got for me? Because, maybe, I have just been diagnosed with cancer, or, I'm taking care of someone who's dying, like one woman came to me in tears after I had taught, I'd given a lecture on Kant, and the basic idea of Kant's being that, our moral worth has nothing to do with the consequences of our actions, that it is only about doing the right thing for the right reason. And she asked me, well, is that really true? And I was like, well, I don't know. I'd use the old teacher's dodge, like, well, what do you think? And, and then she was in tears, and she was talking about how she authorized a surgery for her son that ended up leading to his death. She held this tremendous burden of guilt on her for the consequences of her decision, even though it was the exact opposite of what she wanted and hoped for. And so all of a sudden, it just dawned on me, like, wow, what Kant is talking about is actually very important. And it's not simply a theoretical question of thinking about a trolley problem or something, that this is what people are going through. This is where philosophy comes from. And if philosophy is worth anything, it ought to be able to speak to some of these things and dignify at least the questions that people have, if not sometimes offer them some kind of guidance. And so, to me, it was just my time teaching so-called non-traditional students, nurses, aides, returning vets, retirees, middle-aged people looking to retool themselves in their lives. It's been to me a really profound reminder of the value and importance of philosophy.
Do you get more from teaching it than reading it at this point? I know it's a weird question, but
sometimes. I mean, I definitely get more from teaching things that I have read many times than I do from reading them again, in part because I'm constantly trying to think of how to communicate them, but also when I'm in my zone of a teacher, I'm responding to what others are saying, and then oftentimes they're helping me to see things in a new way, or all of a sudden I realize something that I wouldn't have realized just having looked at it one more time. But I do still love the experience of kind of encountering something that I haven't really dug into, or only, brushed against decades ago, and then diving in again and having that feeling of like, oh my God, yeah, this is much kind of like what you were talking about with the Aeneid. I mean, I had the same experience where I read the Aeneid in college and kind of thought, well, it's sort of boring and not quite as sexy as Homer. And then rereading the Aeneid, a decade or so ago, and then rereading it actually a few years ago with some students, I was just blown away by it. So I still have those great experiences, but there's no doubt that teaching helps considerably.
Do you, and it's a weird follow-up, do you have philosophers you simply did not get who then opened up to you over the years?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
And is there someone you still don't get that you're thinking at some point this is going to become clear, or I'll grow into it? But
yeah, good question. That's a good question. I would want to think about that a bit. I don't know if there's one that I have on my shelves that I'm staring down, but
you can say Heidegger. It's okay. I'm just kidding. Go.
Well, yeah, I did a lot of beating my head on Heidegger. So
I get some of this we just do too young. It's sort of like my experience is similar to yours, and I assume so many people. When you mentioned diving into the existentialists when you're young, it's kind of weird to hit philosophy at what was sort of a terminal point, or at least an end point, as opposed to starting out at the roots of these things. But that's the way of youth, I guess. That's what we're always trying to find the now, and then discovering that there are long roots to these things and echoes that go way back.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, beyond discovering philosophers, I have to say it frequently happens to me that I often discover, or I often revisit works of art, particularly novels or certain movies that I thought I found sort of boring as a college student, and that now I find just absolutely riveting. And I think it's in part because sometimes little, as when I was younger, I wanted, high drama in things, and now I see the powerful dramas that are often in something like just the depiction of some people eating dinner.
Yeah, it's a frequent refrain of mine. The things that we didn't get when we were young, not things that we were assigned, but art in whatever form that we just didn't have it for, I guess, and that we managed to reach at the same time. The great one I use, which I've used a million times on the show, I was lucky not to read it when I was young, and it gets back to Italy, although a different area, The Leopard by Giuseppe Lampedusa, which I only read in my 40s and thought, thank God I did not read this in my 20s or 30s. Wouldn't have meant a thing to me. And as a middle-aged man, I get where this guy's coming from. I felt it a lot more than I knew I would have when I was younger. But
yeah, I know. I mean, it is one of these curious things that sometimes education is wasted, or college is wasted on 18 and 19-year-olds.
I'd always say that. I mean, I went to St. John's immediately after finishing my undergrad. So I was 23, 24. Mm-hmm. And the idea that they were starting them on the Iliad at 18, I was, and Plato also, I was dismissive of. Now I figure, screw it, just go into the deep end. It'll come back to you over the years again and again. It's a lot better than easing into these things, I suppose, and never quite finding the stuff that matters. But
yeah, that's right. And there's something to be said for the power of rereading. Yeah. Furnishing your mind, even with things that don't make a lot of sense to you, is a powerful thing, because it means you get to revisit those things later.
Definitely. Now, what did not make the cut for Rome as a guide? Was there a chapter you wish you could have shoehorned in?
Well, yeah, there are actually a lot of things that didn't make the cut. I mean, I considered, doing something much longer, for instance, on Virgil. Mm-hmm. I mean, Virgil kind of pops up in minor ways here and there, but I really would have loved to have figured out a way of diving into the Aeneid, and because I just find it to be such a fascinating text, and one that is a lot like Rome. That is to say, it's a bit ambivalent. That the Aeneid can be read in one sense as a kind of celebration of imperial Rome and what imperial Rome can do. In another sense, it can be read as just a complete kind of criticism of imperial Rome and what imperial Rome can do, and those things are sort of deeply undecidable throughout the text. And there's a lot of things in the Aeneid itself that actually show misreadings again and again. I mean, famously, Dido sort of misreads Aeneas. He's telling her a story about how he needs to move on, and she's unable to read it as such, and instead is like, oh, he and I are so much alike and we love each other. Or even when Aeneas first comes to Carthage and he's seeing a scene of his own people's defeat, and he's reading it as the lacrimae rerum, the tears of things, and feeling as if these people will appreciate him. But anyway, there's a lot of misreadings going on throughout it, and the text itself sort of embodies that very ambivalence. And to me, that seems so much like Rome, and I thought it'd be great to write on that, but I didn't quite fit in ways that I wanted the text to kind of move along swiftly, and so there were those things, and even any number of other Roman poets like Juvenal, who don't really show up at all. I would have liked to have talked more about the metamorphoses of Ovid.
Yeah, that's the one thing that one chapter was like, oh God, I wish there was more in there. But okay.
Yeah, because that too is just such a great text, and of course there is a lot in Rome that's drawing on Ovid's metamorphoses, and so yeah, it would have been nice to have worked in more of that. But I try to be clear in the book that this is not meant to be exhaustive of ancient Roman literature and philosophy, and certainly not exhaustive of the city of Rome, but that it can maybe model what a kind of guide to the city and its history might look like.
And when you mentioned the imperial abuses, and it comes up throughout the book, as it mentioned, are students more sensitive about that now? Have you seen a change, I guess, in the tone of how students approach the bad stuff, I guess? Are they more dismissive of Rome as a whole because of this sort of thing? I'm working from a completely theoretical background here, having no kids and no engagement with student life. But
well, I do think that is, of course, a kind of common thing, is this desire to kind of dismiss all of Rome as thoroughly corrupt and evil. And I do see little glimmers of it, but the fact of the matter is that the city of Rome itself is kind of its best defense. I mean, as much as you want to criticize the city, first of all, the city itself offers you all the evidence you want. I mean, it doesn't try to hide it. It shows you quite clearly, what it's done and how it achieved its power. And so, the evidence is there for you. At the same time, there's just something profoundly seductive about Rome. I mean, even, the person who is most inclined to dismiss Rome and the history of the West as evil will rarely turn down a free trip to Rome, or even a affordable trip to Rome. I mean, there's something profoundly seductive about its beauties that's there, and again, that's just to me part of what Rome's all about. Like I said, it doesn't offer us easy answers. It doesn't say, we've lived a perfect life and you should come and admire everything great about us. It shows us the evil and it shows us the good, and those two things are so deeply intertwined. You can't sometimes sort them out.
And your pre-visit Rome was Fellini era, essentially, or what was your vision of Rome before you finally got there?
Well, definitely Fellini played a big role in my sense of it. I really loved film and I loved Fellini's movies, and so La Dolce Vita was one of my first visions of Rome. So I imagined a beautiful woman in the Trevi Fountain. My very first images of Rome, though, were also found at the Iowa City Public Library in a book by H.V. Morton called The Fountains of Rome. And I used to check it out. I loved just flipping through the pages, seeing, just all of these fountains. And it just kind of blew my mind that there was a city with so many beautiful fountains in it. So yeah, I mean, it was those kinds of things that initially introduced me to Rome, and I think that's pretty common. I think movies are a pretty common way that.
I should have mentioned Roman Holiday, of course, also, but
yeah, Roman Holiday, and I talk about the movie by Paolo Sorrentino called La Grande Bellezza, The Great Beauty, which I think is a really marvelous kind of movie and sort of trippy tour guide of Rome itself.
Yeah, which I've never seen, and based on your book, I now have to, I either find if it's streaming or get a DVD somewhere. So
yeah, well, and see it, this sounds presumptuous, but I would really recommend watching it twice. The first time, it's just visually so luscious and wonderful, and you just kind of sink into incredible visuals of the city and the craziness of the Romans there. But I find that at least the second time through it, if not the third, fourth, fifth, 10th time through it, all of a sudden you start to see just how thoughtfully put together the movie is, and deeper themes really start to emerge and hit you.
I'll have to give it a view. Now, I do have to ask, only because normally with guests, I don't ask what their next project is because it's a jinx. But you actually mention in your bio, I'm working on a book that's an exploration of food and its centrality to life, a kind of philosophical cookbook called The Angels of Bread. Dish. And I know you just got this book out, but what's the next project? Can you talk a little further about it?
Yeah, I've long loved cooking, and my dissertation director and I, when I was in graduate school, he was a great Italian cook, and so we talked way more about cheese than Play-Doh. And I realized at some level that he was talking to me about philosophy, even when he was talking to me about food. And I worked for a while for this French cook. And so I've long been interested in food. And so I've wanted to write about it for some time. And then this just kind of goes back to what I was talking about with my friend John. The last meal we had together, and this was right before he died, he wanted a meal, and I made him this meal, and I was writing about it actually as he was dying. And it made me want to write more and explore more of the centrality of food in human life. In the medieval philosophers, Dante most famously describes philosophy as the bread of angels, and food becomes a kind of important way that they talk about not just our physical lives, but kind of the way it intersects with the supernatural. Of course, in the Christian tradition, the Eucharist is central to the religion itself, as eating is central to many religions. And so I kind of thought, well, in a way, we're almost in the opposite position of the medievals. They were climbing from their bread all the way up to God, but we sort of need to descend from our virtual worlds back down to the bread we eat. So I thought of this idea of kind of reversing Dante's formulation to making it the angels of bread. And thinking about all the ways that that food is important to our communities, to our lives, to our love, and maybe even to our religious experience.
Feel free to steal this. High Holidays many years ago, Rabbi was explaining one interpretation of fasting during Yom Kippur, which was to become closer to angels who don't eat. And this for 24 hours, we get a little bit closer to God by taking on angel status, or at least taking on angel, not even affliction, because they're not afflicted by this, but reminding us of what it means to be that one step closer, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's, as a Chabad rabbi, so there's a lot of, symbolism and imagery that gets thrown around in there too. But, it was one that stuck with me over the years. So.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you.
Idea for your last meal? Is there something you'd kind of contemplated in relation to John and his death?
Well, so what I made John was, among other things, was a potato soup. And when I was a child, my very first love of food was potato soup. In fact, I compared everything to it. So if I liked the taste of something as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, I would say it tastes like Tato soup. So if I ate a bar of chocolate and I thought, oh, this is pretty good, it tastes like Tato soup. My mom made a very, very good potato soup. And it was odd that when I thought about, what I wanted to make him at the end, and what I was thinking about for myself even, was not necessarily, filet mignon, but though I made some other stuff too. But the was to just have that very kind of deep soul food, comfort food of my mom's potato soup.
Last question, which I should have warned you was coming, but I figure you'll probably have a good answer for it. What are you reading?
What am I reading? Let's see. I'm reading lots of things, but I've been reading tons of poetry recently, and I'm not 100% sure why, but I just started reading the poems of Raymond Carver. Many people, of course, know his short stories, but actually, I'm really just loving reading his poems.
I had just started rewatching Birdman a couple of nights ago, the weird Michael Keaton film where they're adapting Raymond Carver into. So I'll give a little, synchronicity or strange coincidence behind that. But last book or anything that, jumped out at you as, holy crap, I need to give this to other people. Books you foist off on others, I guess.
Here's a book that I just read and I've been recommending, and it came out maybe 2-3 years ago now. But it's Lewis Hyde's A Primer for Forgetting. It's Lewis Hyde. Many people know he has a great book called The Gift, about kind of the structure of giving itself, and particularly in relationship to art. And he has some other really interesting books as well. But this latest one of his, A Primer for Forgetting, is just a fascinating exploration of the importance of forgetfulness, and some of the dangers, but also some of the true possibilities and promises of forgetfulness in human life. And my last chapter in Rome as a Guide to the Good Life begins with an epigraph from an Italian poet that says, "Tutto, tutto, tutto e memoria." Everything is memory. And Lewis Hyde is also reminding me how much is also forgetfulness as well.
It is important. I learned that from Kierkegaard many years ago. I just never put it into practice, particularly as a compulsive neurotic that I am. But yeah.
Well, I mean, a good example of this, to go back to our beginning, so to speak, is when someone dies, we can be sort of overwhelmed by their memory. And one of the beautiful things about, say, a tomb or some kind of memorial is that it in a sense, it allows us to not just memorialize the person and remember them, but it also allows us to forget them for, most of the rest of our lives, that we can go on with our lives liberated from, living in the constant grief of their loss. And yet, so we have the memory, but the memory, strangely enough, also allows us to forget a lot of the time.
I dig. And your book captures a great deal of that in terms of what Rome means. And
yeah,
again, starting with the Protestant cemetery. So
yeah.
It's a book I'm going to be really glad to revisit. And I hope to revisit right before going to Rome for the first time. So I'll keep you apprised.
Drop me a line once you get there.
Oh gosh, you're killing me. It's all I can say. This book just left me with, oh God, I really, especially in the post-diagnosis, there are things I realized I need to do in this world. You've now added to the list. So I guess, darn it, but also thank you so much, man. This book is, I don't want to say life-changing, but, awfully important to me in a very short time.
Thank you so much for saying that. I mean, when I was writing it under lockdown, sometimes it feels like I'm stuffing a message in a bottle and throwing it out to sea and really hoping someone gets it. So it's always nice to hear someone who has, found the bottle and read what's in it and said, yes, message received.
No, this is a wonder, man. But, thanks so much. And thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
And that was Scott Samuelson. You should go read his new book, Rome as a Guide to the Good Life, from University of Chicago. It really is a joy, and it'll inspire you both to get to Rome, as I talked about, and to look more deeply at the world and the lives around you and at yourself. And Scott's two earlier books, The Deepest Human Life and 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering, sound awfully good too. You guys know it's very tough for me to make time to read anything extracurricular, even though right now my extracurricular non-podcast reading is a working through of all of Thomas Pynchon. We won't get into that. Anyway, I hope to find time for those too, is what I'm saying. Now, Scott's website is scottsamuelsonauthor.com, which is all one word, ScottSamuelson author.com. He is not on social media, which is for the best. There's a paragraph explaining why on his contact page, which is pretty entertaining, but it should be pretty clear from our conversation just now as to why it's for the best to stay off of that stuff. I will have a link to the website as well as the book on the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support this podcast by telling other people about it. Just let them know there is a show that comes out almost every week featuring interesting conversations with fascinating creative and cultural figures. You can also help out by telling me what you like and don't like about the show, who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or music or piece of theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by writing me, send me a postcard or a letter or email or DM, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, just call back, leave another message, and also let me know if it would be okay to use your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might say some interesting stuff, but I would never want to run that stuff in an episode without the speaker's permission. So let me know. If you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I do just fine with my day job. I hope you'll give to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms. And through those, you can find ways to help people with medical bills or rent, or getting artistic projects off the ground, or helping them foster out a dog or something. But when it comes to institutions in need, I give to my local food bank every month. I make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign and Planned Parenthood. I make targeted election contributions because that's part of my day job as a lobbyist. But there are other things you can contribute to, like freedom funds and election funds and other things that will help us build a better world. So I hope you will. Oh, and as I mentioned at the top, I finally made the second issue of my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. It is at the printer right now, along with a second printing of the first issue. This is May 30th, 2023 for you time travelers out there. The new one is 32 pages of my poems, essays, photography, art, and an excerpt of my great conversation with Clive James from 2015. If you'd like that one or the first issue or both, drop me a line. They're free. If you want to send me some money to support this stuff and what I do, you can send me money through paypal.me/VMSpod, or subscribe to my Substack, which is vmspod.substack.com. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.